So I'm just going to talk about how I was able to understand and process RBG's ethos, kind of as a woman physician, particularly as it, kind of pertains to reproductive rights. She was always present, always there, and understanding, kind of really, where did she come from? How did it come into being that she was able to pave this like profound way that our society looks, views, because not only did that happen in the United States, it spilled over across the world. I don't know if many of you know, she actually spent time in Sweden and other parts of the world. And so, kind of, she didn't touch just us, she touched pretty much all humans across the planet. And so kind of really looking at that breadth and depth of experience and kind of the many lives that she impacted and how that was able to come to be was kind of the pathway I took. So I think it's really important that people understand that she fundamentally challenged the Constitution. I mean, bottom line, right? She really, kind of meekly, it was, it's so funny, her Constitution, the way she is, the things that she's experienced in her life, kind of, it took people off guard, as do many graceful, authentic, kind of leaders around the world. And so, kind of when you start thinking about her ethos, one of the very first things is, kind of really challenging the very first sentence of the Constitution and building your life's work around it is pretty amazing, right? So we, the people, she not only, she took that first statement, the opening statement of the Constitution, and said, hey, I'm a Jewish chick that happens to have a child, and I'm not part of the people. That people doesn't include me, and doesn't include many of the people that I love. And it was funny, she didn't really come to understand that until actually much later in her life. She kind of lived somewhat in ignorant bliss of that. But when she came into her practice, into her being, and really understood what it is that she was doing, it was challenging a fundamental belief of the definition of the word people. So, kind of saying, okay, people are all people. It doesn't matter if they have an X chromosome, a Y chromosome, and or the physiologic manifestations thereof, or the paradigm thereof, if they have brown skin, white skin, red skin, yellow skin, whatever it happens to be. She took the pathway of women's definition of being part of the people, but as a result of that, opened the door for all humans to be, considered and have equal dignity and ultimately count equally before the law. She became the face of the 14th Amendment of the US Constitution to the Supreme Court, and then ultimately sat on that court and challenged the fractured laws that court oversees. And so when you think about her ethos is, let's fundamentally challenge the most basic truths that we hold, right? And as you guys know, the millennials, there's no truth without Ruth, right? Kind of that piece is extremely important to understand, that she took on the very first statement of the Constitution. So when she did that, kind of, she said that, kind of what Martin Luther King was to Thurgood Marshall is what, kind of Ruth Bader Ginsburg was to Gloria Steinem. Kind of, there were these people that were quiet intellectuals behind the scenes, fundamentally changing the societal structures, why there were pairs of a more outward facing kind of the extroverted, charismatic leaders of both the civil rights movement and subsequently the women's rights movement. And when you look at the four of them, they used language and words in ways that profoundly moved people intellectually and emotionally. And, you know, kind of when you review the historical narrative of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and you actually hear her speak, there's some sort of almost divine intervention that comes in, some archetypal kind of leader that comes through when she says this quote, you know, from Sarah Grimke of, you know, I ask no favors for my sex. All I ask is of our brethren is that they take their feet off our necks. And it's so funny to see this diminutive woman turn into this just kind of, you know, kind of magnificent kind of being when those words come through her. And I've seen her say that several times. It's the same kind of manifestation. Her eyes kind of sparkle up. She has this kind of smirk on her face, and her, you know, kind of her posture changes. And whenever she says it, no matter how many times you hear it, you just are like, yeah, you know, it invokes our limbic brain. It invokes the emotional part, the most emotional and psychological part of our brain that says, yeah, I want some of that. You can't really put language to it. It's just an invoking of an emotion that knocks at the core of us. You know, it's very similar to, you know, kind of, you've got, again, all of those leaders, you know, it's similar to Martin Luther King's I have a dream speech, you know, kind of, I have a dream, like, you know, take your feet off our necks. I mean, it invokes, again, that really significant high level emotion to gain people to say, yes, I also fundamentally believe in that. And so therefore, you know, the movement of women along with those of civil rights were able to be moved further forward. Okay, guys.
Jennifer, I see. Yeah, I see. Thank you. I see one person has their hand up, and I don't know if it's a question for you or a technical question. So Mona, is it a technical question or a question for Dr. Clark?
You're on mute, sweet. Yeah.
Wait, Mona, you're muted. Can you unmute yourself? And then I think John Boston's going to put his number in the chat. So if and when people have technical questions, they can call John. Well, let's see what it is with Mona. Still can't hear you. Oh, you can't unmute yourself. John, maybe you could call Mona. John is our tech wizard.
Got to have one of those nowadays.
Oh, John, he did it. Okay, no, it was just an accident. I don't know how it got raised. My hand got raised, and I don't know how to lower it.
Okay.
Sorry.
Excellent.
No worries.
Okay.
Are we good?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay, sounds great. Okay, so, you know, kind of the one thing that I really was shocked by was, you know, the argument that she made to the, you know, one of the 6 cases that she presented to the Supreme Court as a litigator was taking the path where she found the father who had, and many of you guys probably know this story, but for those of you who don't, I'll do a quick summary. She represented a man who unfortunately had lost his wife due to one of the really rare but very devastating complications of childbirth called a pulmonary embolism. Here he is, a young man in his 20s with a newborn child in the late, you know, kind of mid to late 60s, and he had no wife. And he found himself saying, you know, my wife's contributed to Social Security, why can't I get her funds as she would if I had died? And taking on that case, she argued that sex discrimination, primarily burdened by women, hurts everyone, that men included are harmed by these laws, that though their intention was to be inclusive, drafted by white men who were, most of them fairly wealthy, unintentionally excluded significant people because of this, kind of the society's stage of development with which it was, produced. And so she, kind of, again, the ethos is based in challenging the fundamental truths so that you can recognize how it hurts everybody, that, this fundamental truth is no longer serving anyone. So, kind of taking those two big pieces, then you move into, kind of the notorious RBG. And for those of us who grew up in the 90s, when I heard Notorious RBG, I was like, oh my gosh, that's hilarious that they're comparing her to the, Notorious BIG, for those of us who grew up with rap and hip hop. And so, kind of the third part of her ethos is standing strong, is that no longer tolerating or accepting even the smallest steps forward, that at this point, our Constitution is no longer serving all of us. And we need to continually, no matter how uncomfortable it is, come to rectification of that. And so, kind of has she shifted into the one where, kind of her role as somewhat of the peacemaker on the bench, where her, kind of, if you look at the movie, if you guys have not seen the documentary, the Notorious RBG, there's a really good couple scenes in there where they show where she started on the bench and where she was by the time that she ended her life and ended her term on the bench, where she went from kind of moderate liberal to one of, kind of, she was second all the way. And really saying, kind of, it was my job to hold to what I believe to be true, and to often strongly dissent, challenging not only the Constitution, challenging our definition of what we call people, challenging this concept of equally represented and protected by the law. But she did that and held firm through significant turmoil and change in the political environment and ultimately legal environment of the United States. And so, significant change has to hold firm. And this, being a strong dissent, what people don't understand is that she changed the process of how the law goes. Like she broke protocol. You don't write strong dissents. It was like a no-no. Like it, so she not only broke protocol of challenging the Constitution, challenging the, inferior, because she has this long like laundry list of, kind of subject to inferiority, status of women. But then she said, I'm going to challenge the court in the way that they actually manage things so that we can get this done and done appropriately. And so, so this ethos is like, okay, that's actually pretty amazing. Okay, so how do we change? How do we do that for medicine, right? So those are the things I was, kind of when I was reading her stories in a deep, detailed kind of piece of things. Like, there's so many documentaries and movies and stuff about her now. She wrote her own book, as well as the beautiful picture book. If you guys haven't seen it, done by a couple of millennials that were enamored with her, that were, kind of spurred by the kind of Notorious RBG movement. And so, spending time in those texts, this is what I gleaned from them, that I was like, those are the things that struck in my limbic brain, my heart, to kind of say, okay, this is what she represented to the world. The cool thing is that I absolutely love human development. And I study people like her who are able to rise above the fallacies of the, kind of our basic human nature, right? How do these, kind of creative lives, kind of come into being? How do they come into fruition? So not only did her ethos extend to her professional world, but she lived and breathed it as a model in her personal world as well. And she shared that with us, you know? So for those of you who know, I'm sorry, this is going to be probably a little bit repetitive, but for those of you who don't, she was, you know, kind of one of 3 women, you know, 9 in her, you know, school of 500 plus at Harvard, you know, just the whole not being represented thing. She was one of those people that she was just like, yeah, I just want to go to law school, you know, kind of thing, and didn't think twice of it and just did it and just kept going on. You know, she has a unique background in that, you know, she was born in Brooklyn. She's a, you know, on one side a near first generation American. But as someone who's a palliative care physician and someone who has an interest in human development, particularly young adults affected by mortality and death, she lost her sister when she was 2 years old. So she had a sister who died of meningitis. And so she was introduced to death in her early life. And she lost her mother at the age of 17, the day before her high school graduation. Her mother, as she states frequently, is the archetype that drives her life. And always holding those things that her mother taught her very close, the primary ones being always make sure that you are independent, and always make sure that you do not spend your time in frivolous emotions such as anger. Those 2 things held through, along with many advice from her mother, subsequent mother-in-law and father-in-law, and we'll get to her notorious partner here in a second. But what she constantly said was, the reason why I was successful is that, you know, each part of her life, she didn't ignore, she didn't give in to this fallacy of work-life balance, right? Because if you say work-life balance, that means you're already pitting your work and your life against each other, right? And so she was able to understand the model. So Erik Erikson is a human developmental, you know, kind of really like big guy in human development, and kind of talks about this as life is extrapolated in work, play, and love. And she played that to the hilt. Like she said, you know, each part of my life provided respite from the other and gave me a sense of proportion. The reason why she was able to do this in 1950s and 1960s America was unbelievable. And there were several reasons why that occurred. So we're going to walk through them. So first and foremost, from her work, when you hear her talk about work, the discipline and passion allowed her, you know, kind of what we call in human development flow. She found she was all consumed and in love with the law and everything it represented. And, you know, kind of, she talks about, you know, kind of growing up during the communist situation and saying that, you know, kind of our law was created in such a way that these people can exist. And we've created a space where that conversation can occur. That's really cool. How does that, you know, you could see, you know, kind of as the stories unfold, the love affair that she had with the law. And so her work, you know, kind of allowed her to be the highest expression of herself and be in a state of flow. And the quote that she always has with that is, you know, fight for the things that you care about, but do it in a way that will lead others to join you. When someone is impassioned about something and it resonates with you, that's what that, you know, kind of, that's what it constantly means. And she fully did that in her work. But as you can imagine, in 1950s and 1960s America, sadly, and as she fully admits on her own, she would have been unable to do that with what she called a dear partner in life. Marty Ginsburg, she met, you know, kind of in her, you know, kind of early years of college. And he was a man way ahead of his time. His self-confidence, his self-possession allowed him to be in the presence of a very bright, beautiful woman and not be threatened by it at a time where he was given permission and encouraged to do so. He was the reason why she did what she did. She was the quiet, as she says, sober one, whereas Marty was the outgoing, gregarious, extroverted one. She found not only that partnership in her work with Gloria Steinem, but she found that in her personal life with her husband, Marty Ginsburg. She surrounded herself with people that allowed her to shine in every way, shape, or form, despite and kind of within the context of the societal norms that would threaten to kind of crush many women of that time. The stories you hear about her, kind of how they traded off in childcare, and the silly stories they say that she's a horrible cook and a horrible driver, like she just couldn't master either one of those skills, and that there was no threat about that. It was just, I can do this, you can do this, what can we do together? They were very much a couple that created a massive third thing that not only was their family, but was the women's civil rights movement. It was a remarkable story to bear witness to, and then to hear reflections of. And so again, when you think about the triad of work, play, and love, she was able to understand the importance of the significant relationships in one life, particularly in it as it kind of appeals in the love of intimate relationships and family life. One thing that was really interesting, I found that she struggled with most was actually the identification as a mother. There was that was actually the biggest hurdle oftentimes she had to overcome, that it was the identification of a mother, when she got to, kind of law school, when she graduated, kind of the concern about being a mother and, kind of the child rearing aspects of her life. It's interesting to hear how they shared those equally, and shifted depending on what was going on, again, in the third thing of their relationship, and then the biggest third thing of the law within the both of their lives. And so, so it's interesting and potentially a model for how one lives not only your professional life, but walks your walk and talks your talk in your personal life. So that, again, there's not this constant jockeying back and forth between the fallacy of a work-life balance. Play is extremely important. And when you look at the great minds of our time, like RBG, they all had play. Every single one of them will talk about how they carved out time and spent in play. And you hear her and her love of the opera, and for those of you who have never seen it, she actually starred in an opera called, The Duchess of Krakenthorpe. It's a hilarious take. If you haven't seen it, I would definitely have you look it up on YouTube. But she loved the opera. And when you watch her watch the opera, that is flow in its obvious state. She gets enraptured in it. She gets totally caught in the stream. And hear her talking about the extraordinary human voice in an aria, how it just, kind of enraptures her completely. And she's able to play, she's able to let go of all of this stuff, whether it's the identity of as a mother, the identity as a Supreme Court justice. She's able to get lost in the play, particularly of opera. She also talks being lost in the play of her grandchildren and her children. And so, learning to be able to take one's attention and find, being enraptured in the different aspects of work, play, and love in a whole life form is something that she exhibits. I mean, she's an exhibition on stage for all of us to follow. I would imagine that many people now, many people to come, will incorporate her as an archetype into their lives based on this idea, that one doesn't beget the other, that that it all goes together. So those were my thoughts on the ethos of RBG, and it becomes kind of, how do you apply the same kind of concept to medicine? So how do you take the first constitution of medicine? For those of us in the lay public, I would venture to say that 90% of you say, first, do no harm. The Hippocratic Oath, even though that actually didn't include in the Hippocratic Oath, there were different variations on it. It's probably the closest constitution we have to medicine. And this is, kind of PRIMUM non nocere, depending on if you're Latin or if you use the hard C, is the way we talk about first, do no harm. And so taking a stab at applying Ruth's ethos to medicine, I challenge the concept of first, do no harm. So what happened is the whole practice of medicine, very similar to the Constitution of the United States, was based on some fundamental beliefs. And one of them is this concept of dualism. So unfortunately, modern medicine came at a time where the church and state were being ripped apart. And the scientists, Descartes amongst them, unintentionally disintegrated us as human beings and said, okay, church, you can take the mind and the spirit, you give us scientists the body. And so gave birth to the physical reductionist model of modern medicine. That physical reductionist model then led to constant study of disease. We like things that, kind of typically, and funny enough, we're going to be talking about this, the concepts of epidemics, famine, and war, and the consequences thereof, the diseases thereof, infections, injury, and starvation. When medicine started, that's all they were dealing with. And it's, kind of, how do we deal with the eradication of disease? And so as a consequence, the current definition, as defined in the late 1700s, is that health is the absence of disease. As we'll see here in a second, World War II marked a very different change in the way we think of health. And the World Health Organization tried to put that into language and actually said in 1948, mind you, that, kind of health is the balance of physical, mental, and social well-being, not merely the absence of disease. So they gave it a good college try. But unfortunately, by leaving that piece in there, the human mind misses the whole first part and says, okay, health is the absence of disease. And so the entire educational system in medicine, whether it be medicine as physicians, medicine as nurses, or anything thereof, is centered around this concept of health as the absence of disease. So, as a consequence to that, then our healthcare system has been built around this concept of the rule of rescue, meaning we're constantly pulling people up out of the depths of disease, and we're missing the whole boat on the possibility of flourishing, the possibility of growing someone's health. So our healthcare system is not really a healthcare system. It's a disease management system, or sick care, if you want to say that. And that rule of rescue is what has been underlying our educational system in medicine, as well as the delivery system of medicine since its inception. And so the question becomes, how is this now serving us? Well, we started to ask that question. So in the United States, particularly, it says, well, we're one of the most wealthy countries in the world, and we actually spend a lot of money, much more so than any other developed country in the world, on healthcare spending as part of our gross domestic product. That purple line that you guys see there is the United States relative to all the other westernized countries in the world. Okay, we spend close to about 18 to 20% of our GDP given the year on healthcare expenditures. You can see the gap there between everybody else. Okay, so we invest in this idea of the rule of rescue. How has it really helped us? Not much. This was pretty damning data that came out in 2016 that rose a lot of people's eyes. There were several people kind of raising the red flag and, saying this, kind of in the late 90s and the early 2000s to no avail. And we continued down this road. And now the United States has one of the worst life expectancies of the Western world. You add COVID-19 to that, and that 78 is now closer to 76, and even worse for some of our minority populations. And so the question I ask, again, first, do no harm. So I teach high school students as well as college and graduate students and medical students, and always the question is, what the hell, right? Totally rip that off the Netflix show, but it's like, how the hell did we get here? How did this get so bad? And so I'm going to take you through a little bit of a historical narrative that then will give perspective to the societal norms that have come, to be established as truth. So this little lamb is us. We're stuck in this really tenuous place between these two behemoths of the health industry. Talk about that guy that's driven by, kind of the food industry and entertainment, particularly, and the healthcare industry that is driven by pharma and the payer system. We're stuck between these two things, saying healthcare and health, and neither one is serving us. And how did that occur? So first and foremost, we were doing pretty okay up until World War II, as I said, right? World War II changed everything. We'll talk about World War II being a pivotal point in human evolution. But, what World War II did socially is introduce the GI Bill, which delayed onset of adult behaviors because people were going to college. Okay, so this higher education bill allowed people to go get higher education and delay adulthood, which then led to the era of medical technology. Guys, we didn't have antibiotics 100 years ago. Okay, I mean, it's insane what has happened, not only in the last 100 years, but even in my medical career. I lived to watch HIV turn into AIDS, turn into a fatal illness, turn into one that's like, meh, it's a chronic illness. It's like, it's, the remarkability that we've had with heart attacks, strokes, trauma, all the things that, again, epidemics, famine, war, right? All this technology has occurred. You couple that with the social change of the 60s and 70s and the assertion of autonomy. And all of a sudden, our healthcare system turned into a business model for consumers. And we went from a public utility where, kind of physicians particularly acted as a, kind of a vocational aspect to serving people, to one very quickly to a cog in a wheel of a very big machine. And we've hit the point of diminishing returns, which has given us the result of having the worst life expectancies in the world. So this is going to be some heady stuff, so stick with me for a second. So what is, yeah, do you have a question?
Well, do you want to hear a couple of quick questions?
Yeah, sure. Before we get into the second part, yeah.
Heady philosophy.
Yeah.
2 questions. One, do our USA healthcare expenditures include drug research expenses? So I'm thinking yes, but I don't know.
So it depends.
Mhm.
So, kind of what that healthcare is, the GDP really looking at Medicare and the spending and is associated with that. So if they're drugs that are delivered as part of the insurance benefit of Medicare, then yes, pharma is the biggest lobby. So that percentage I showed you is GDP spent directly on healthcare. Is the R&D of pharma as part of that through the NIH, through research things? Yes, but that's not necessarily included in that percentage. That's in addition to.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, that's connected, I think, to the next question, which
yeah,
it seems to be, well, and this is, I think, what you're saying about big business, that medicine relies on this rapid remedy, prescribed surgery, fee for services, and all about taking meds. And that seems connected to what you're saying about big pharma being the biggest lobby. So
yeah, I mean, the system is built to deal with sick care. And if the system is built for sick care, they want you to remain sick.
Because that's how they make money.
Right. And is that really anybody's intention? I don't think so when it was started, for sure, but that's what it's turned into now. And everybody talks about for-profit versus non-for-profit hospitals, and they're still under the same payer system. It's still driven by the same system, guys. Kind of how operations occur and things may be a little bit different with regards to for-profit versus non-for-profit. But generally speaking, if you're part of the health care system, you're part of this business machine based on fee-for-service, revenue generating, kind of, as I call it, the dollars per toe per day mindset.
Okay, great. Well, I'm with you, and I just wanted to make sure, because what you're saying is, with the RBG ethos, is that you're challenging the first do no harm premise, because because we are doing harm.
We're directly causing harm.
Right. So that is not a strong enough foundation anymore for medical care.
It's no longer serving us.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Cool.
We're dying early as a consequence of it, because it kind of the system propagates this concept of disease, right? And hasn't shifted from the formal definition of health, very similar to, her ethos of challenging what the definition of people are. We're now challenging this definition of health. The definition of health is the absence of disease, is not appropriate, right? Mm-hmm. And so, kind of what does that look like?
But I think we're ready to go on. What does that look like?
So one of my, you talk about archetypes that, and people that you want to be when you grow up. I want to be Jonas Salk when I grow up. For those of you who don't know Jonas Salk, he was the guy that came up with the polio vaccine. There's a couple different ones, but he's one of the guys that came up with that. But what people don't know is he was a bio-philosopher. Like, he really looked at human evolution and said, where are we headed? What are we doing? And he wrote this really famous, pretty amazing book called The Survival of the Wisest, and predicted during the, kind of social movement of the 60s and 70s that we were amidst this massive inflection point of human evolution. How cool is it that we get to live through this? I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. I was born right at the time that this came out. And I was like, this is amazing. And what he states, and now he's now died, obviously, and his son and him were writing a book before his death that's called The New Reality. So if that's something you guys like, it's a gorgeous adult picture book, as someone who's visually inclined. And this is a picture, this is one of the graphics from there. But basically he's saying that if you look at any species, because we're arrogant, we think we're so damn special, but we're just a bunch of animals, kind of, even though we got some higher brains, we're, Mother Nature, we're just one of the many, right? And Mother Nature has her way of correcting things, as we've experienced this last year, right? So, so what he says is that at some point, kind of there is a society that lives in what they call the A values. So this is the population growth strategy, where you're going up like this, where it's consumption, consumption, production, 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 production. And then all of a sudden it hits a point that says, okay, we're actually going to annihilate ourselves if we continue down this road of production, consumption, and production and consumption. And there's an inflection point where the society, whether it's ants, whether it's humans, fruit flies, chimpanzees, whatever it happens to be, an inflection point where the societal norms change into B values, which are more of, kind of integration, more of, kind of higher thinking. And it's the shift from the survival of the fittest to the survival of the wisest. And many people, it's pretty crazy to have been reading about this and then having the pandemic hit this last year, that, there's thoughts that this is, even though we've suffered pandemics in the past, this pandemic is directly caused by human behavior and its impact on the Mother Earth, right? Because up until now, we've had things fairly well under control. But, kind of the growing population, the growing consumption, the invasion we have into the animal world is starting to blur the lines again. And so it's an inflection point that, the pandemic basically unhoused all of the gaping wounds we had in the institutions that we have held true. So education is now being challenged, healthcare is now being challenged, the law is being challenged. I mean, everything that every institution that we've built from a societal level has been called into question. And that's what this inflection point is about. And so it's we don't have a choice. It's we've got pressure to do so. And so so when you start challenging these long held truths, we have to, kind of, as Ruth talks about, the Supreme Court is responsible for repairing the fractures of the law. How do we, because we don't have a high court in medicine, sadly, we're going to have to do this as a community. This is a community, grassroots, at the heart of where we live on a day-to-day basis. We will have to repair the fractures of medicine based on these three truths. One, the primarily physical reductionist model of medicine that's based on the split between the body, mind, and spirit. Two, health, does not equal healthcare. And three, that health is not a state, but something wholeheartedly different. And so we're just going to run through those three held truths and apply, kind of what RBG has already taught all of us. So health is integrated. It's very clear now. Our science, so it's really funny, science and religion are finally coming back together. So, kind of, we finally are like, okay, we can no longer separate the spirit and its so-called brother in the mind from the body. They kind of go hand in hand. There's no separating those things with, kind of the growing understanding of mental health, the growing understanding of neurosciences, in addition to the higher levels of consciousness study that is occurring. We fundamentally know and are becoming more and more aware collectively of what we call the spirit. So religion has called this the soul, but science is calling it consciousness. We actually know, for those of us who actually particularly take care of those at the end of life, when you are then kind of bear witness to someone dying, there is something that fundamentally and directly is experienced at the moment of death. And we have tried to describe when the spirit or the consciousness exits the body, what happens, right? Well, from a science standpoint, we all know that energy can never be created or destroyed. It can only transform. So where is that energy that leaves the body? And science is totally okay with asking that question, finally. And so we're starting to see one of the reasons why the healthcare system is disintegrating is that we're starting to see that, yes, we need to have a disease management system, but it only needs to be one fraction of 1% of what we need to be offering. We need to be offering the paradigm of prevention. And then how do we actually, as a physician, how do I help people be their best selves? How do I foster flourishing? How do I foster this, kind of sense of proportionality that Ruth Bader Ginsburg was talking about? That's what I signed up for, right? That's what I went to medical school for. And that's really interesting. And now we're finally being given permission societally to talk about this. So that's the first thing, is debunking the truth that health is the physical reductionist model to the body. It's a hell of a lot more than that, and much, much more interesting. So the way I see that, though, is that, the great psychologists that have existed before us, Abraham Maslow is my favorite guy. We'll talk about him in a second. But, we all know that we are born as dependent. We're one of the longest standing dependent beings in the mammalian world. That then as we gain ability, we have to assert our independence. Many people stop here. We stop here because we value independence, particularly in the United States, right? We may get into relationships, but many of our relationships are in parallel. We may, cohabitate and things like that. But when you become a fully interdependent being, there is this idea that you have something to offer to serve the world with, where you truly engage in other human beings' lives in the world around you. And we're now finding many, many people are moving into this transcendent stage where they get beyond themselves, they get beyond their in-group, and they start seeing people at a higher human level, which is driving, again, the S-curve that we talked about in the survival of the wisest. So it's, again, articulating this idea that we are much, much more than this bag of bones that we so-called base our, kind of definition of health on, right? Secondly, health is a communal activity. So health does not equal healthcare, right? We know, based on the social determinants of health that we'll see here in a second, that 10%, healthcare gets about a lousy 10%. And guess what that 10% is for? Infections, injury, and acute, bodily, kind of metabolic derangements that you may have. So, kind of that 10%, but everything else is about who you live with, where you live, and how you live your life. And so, it's communal, that you live within a population that lives within a public that then represents your community. And so we've got to get in this mindset that health doesn't belong in the healthcare system. It belongs where you kind of live or breathe every single day. So I'm just going to point this nasty piece of data out to kind of prove my point. So this is from Wilkinson. If you guys like TED Talks, this, just type in Wilkinson income inequality. So to get further into the fact that this is a communal level, they tried to figure out, okay, the spending of the GDP in the US should give us, kind of what's this healthcare paradox in the United States where we spend the most and have the worst healthcare outcomes. It's this. It's the difference between the haves and the have-nots. That the US has the biggest gap in the wealthiest and the poorest. And as a result, it is the underpinning for why we have such horrible health and social outcomes. It's pretty much been proven over and over and over again. So health is not healthcare. Health is a communal activity, and it's all about the social determinants of health, of how you live, where you live, and who you live with. This is a busy slide, but it gives you an idea of how health is broken down in this concept. Orange is the United States. The different studies are the World Bank inequity rating. So the difference between the haves and the have-nots, the US is the worst. Social mobility index, so the ability from someone to move from a lower socioeconomic status to a higher one, the United States is right up there with the United Kingdom. life expectancy, like I said, where the worst, that's actually much worse now. Teenage pregnancy, obesity, infant mortality. I studied this in medical school. Cuba ranks higher than we do. Murder rate, prison population, poverty rate, income difficulties, voting rights, kind of the way, how many people are able to vote, and trust. It's really interesting, right? So again, health is not healthcare. Health is a communal activity. So, yeah, we must first do no harm. Finally, I'll leave you kind of with an idea.
You have a question in the chat that says,
Sure.
What do we do?
Oh, sorry, Barbara.
What should we do? Should we move to another country?
It's so funny that you say that. So yeah, right. That's, it's like, oh my gosh, what do I do about this, right? It's a big problem. It's a huge problem, right? But we have never challenged this before. There's not enough, again, when you hear about Ruth's story about women's civil rights, she will talk about, kind of how lucky I was born in a time where the society was ready to have this conversation. Society's ready to have this conversation, guys. We just got to start having it. So talk about it. Start living your own personal lives, because guess what, guys? The cool thing is that the healthcare system is a consumer-driven system. So the consumers have got to demand something different than the system for the system, right? That's the unique thing about this. And so it's funny because Wilkerson, the guy that wrote the study on income inequalities from the UK, he's like, yeah, if you want to live the American dream, move to Denmark. that was his line. Yeah, that was his quote. But kind of, if in the spirit of kind of what Ruth Bader Ginsburg said to us is that how lucky we are born in a time where we must and are now being given permission to have these conversations and challenge these long-standing truths that no longer serve us.
Yeah. I'm going to follow that up with one question before you do this last slide. Interesting. I think I know where the person's coming from who says, are you saying that interdependence is the same as dependence? Which I think I'm interpreting that because you said interdependence is about like serving others, and dependence might seem like that. But before you answer that, I also wanted to throw in that in social justice movement theory today, people are also talking about shifting from a rights framework to a framework of interdependence, which is really paralleling what you're saying, right? Instead of individual rights, which so much of our democracy has been built on into up to this point, it's got to be my right balanced with your needs, right? It has to be more reciprocal. It can't just be right. So it's interesting.
So one, reciprocal is the really important thing here. So as a dependent being, you're born into your family of origin and you got no choice about that. As we move into an interdependent being and move into interdependence, you move into your family of choice, and family is a loose term here, whatever community. So true interdependence is a choosing of dependence, is a choosing of reciprocity. It's being conscious about saying, I'm ready and willing to engage and create something else with you. So it's the choice making that is the difference. It's being conscious and having the ability and the freedom. So this is kind of where the argument, is where free will comes into play, that we exercise our full free will to be at the service of others.
Nice. And I'm assuming codependence fits in the dependent category.
Right. It's about survivability. There's not really a choice in it, right? As you can see on this slide, it's Maslow's fundamental, kind of physiologic and or psychological needs. So it's not really a choice. It's just trying to survive.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm going to offer you these last couple of slides is that, kind of one of the last pieces, the long hard stand truth is that health is a state. You're either in or you're not. So you're either failing or winning, right? Because that's the American ethos, right? Win at all costs, right? And, kind of going back to that picture of the lamb stuck between two things, when you think of health, I like her stuff, so don't get me wrong, but like, you think of Gwyneth Paltrow, right? We have the typical blonde American thin model entertainment kind of thing. And if you're not that, you're not healthy, right? So it's this failure of binary stuff of, if you don't look like that, you're not healthy kind of thing. And so, kind of really challenging this idea that health is not a finite game. It's not a win or lose, yes or no, in it or not in it. It's an infinite game. And the goal is to just stay in the goddamn game, right? I just want to be in the game and resource myself in order to stay in the game and and have fun playing in the game as long as I possibly can, right? So health is the ability to meet one's fundamental needs, giving the opportunity to have the skills, given the chance to have the skills and the experience of living the fullest life that I have capable to me, right? It's meeting these basic needs. I mean, Maslow laid them out years ago. We still breathe them today. How many people are living in this vast, wealthy country that don't have their basic physiologic needs met? And as long as we have a population of people in that, all of us suffer. Everyone suffers. So we have to give people the ability to meet their most fundamental and basic needs. And as we do that as a society, we'll find that we don't have to focus on food, water, shelter, sleep. We don't have to focus on creating safe homes for people. We can start focusing on love and belonging, true interdependence, where as a self-esteemed individual, I can consciously choose to exercise my given gifts to help other people and become fully self-actualized. And the more we can move along that path, the closer and closer we can get to living a life to the full hilt, just like RBG did. So that's it, guys. That's my 2 cents.
Thank you. I think well, that's nice. A comment, no one needs to earn or deserve to meet their fundamental needs, right? That's part of the dominant social ethos, I guess. Let's see, here's another question. Yeah, how do we get there? I think that I see a question in the chat that is about how do we get there. This person thinks this is from Earl, thinks the major change needed is a more equally represented government. I mean, you said this is going to be a grassroots movement, right? This is we the people, we are the consumers. So how do we?
Yeah, that's what I mean. That was one thing that was really hard for me to kind of draw parallels to, because the High Court oversees the law, right? There is no High Court of Medicine, right? So how, kind of communities, we're starting to see communities pull together and demonstrate, okay, this is, again, it's what do we fundamentally believe, right? We fundamentally believe that health is and the ability for people to meet, kind of creating an environment where people have the ability to meet their own fundamental needs. Like that's our responsibility as the community, right? And they're building, everything is based on that idea, including the government, including public health, and including population health. And so it starts with the, we fundamentally believe it's our responsibility as a community to create an environment where people have the ability to meet their own fundamental needs. And so it's starting there, and it's starting in small pockets. We're starting to see it across the world. Some of you may have seen, it's a little commercially, but it kind of gets to the same idea, this whole concept of the blue zones, places around the world where they have longstanding octogenarians that they've committed to this idea that, it's about human flourishing. It's about like staying in the game as long as you possibly can and playing it really, really well up until the time you're like 100. And then when you're not, we're making sure that you're comfortable on the sidelines watching the game and participating as much as you possibly can right up to the last moment. And so, so there's models for this across the country, but we have to decide, we have to, we have to decide what's most important to us. And that's that shifting from values A to values B that you see in the survival of the wisest. And, you know, in the United States, because we're so deep into values A still about consumption and production, it's not going to happen on that large scale until there's a tipping point of, you know, kind of innovative and early adopter communities that then create the, you know, kind of, you know, this tipping point where communities are starting to move further and further to the point where the collective then tips, you know, kind of towards that direction.
I'm looking for questions in the chat. I mean, that's a hopeful vision, but you're making me think. I mean, I know some countries talk about, you know, putting well-being into the gross national product,
Yeah.
right? So that's something that we could invest in as communities. But at the same time, I think about how much power doctors have, in a way, how doctors have become like the priests of the church. You know, it's so interesting what you said about science and religion coming together, and the fact that there is no higher court for medicine. So it's very hard. I mean, I feel powerless as regards my national government, federal government, as Earl's saying, but I also feel powerless as it regards, you know, the practice of medicine, because doctors are so unto themselves. And there are some nurses on this call too.
But that's the whole thing. That's the farce, right? So it's not the practice of medicine. It's the practice of what you're doing right now, Barbara. You're contributing more to people's health than I am as a physician. Right? You're creating an environment, right? You're helping, you know, a flock of people create an environment where human flourishing at all souls is a premise for what we fundamentally believe in. Because as I said, I only get 10% of someone's health, and they have to have an infection, an injury, or a metabolic derangement in order to get to see me, right? So let's relegate the disease management system and let it serve the 10%. But the 90% has nothing to do with doctors, has nothing to do with nurses. It has to do with you guys sitting here on a Tuesday night talking about things and saying, okay, how am I going to apply this to my own individual life? And if I have the capacity to meet my own needs, how do I help others meet their own fundamental basic needs? And others, and others, and others, and others.
That's interesting. There's some nice, I know we have to end soon, it's late. There's some nice comments in here about the shift from all male physicians to female physicians. We're honoring RBG. This is in her honor. That might be a great closing comment from you, is do you think there's more chance of it shifting faster now that more women are involved in healthcare, or do you see a difference in providers?
It's interesting, right? So we're, you know, it's funny because that didn't happen until to school. So medical education, the shift to the 50-50 mark in law school and medical school happened in the same year. It happened in 2017. So that was, you know, it was the first time that occurred. I went to school well before that. But if you look at the practice of medicine and you look at who are the full professors and people who are tenured, it's still very heavily male dominated. So we're still living, particularly white male dominated, and we're still living that legacy. We're in the midst right now of a generational change in the leadership in medicine. And so my guess, you know, kind of, it's now 2021, you know, we're 5 years into that 50-50 mark. It's going to take another 5 to 10 years to see that fully come into fruition in the leadership in medicine. And so it's happening though. I mean, here I am, you know, a hospice and palliative medicine physician. You know, I was in my 40s at the time, became a chief medical officer of a large healthcare system. That was unheard of even 10 years ago, right? So yeah, you know, kind of, it's definitely shifting, but it's really crazy, you know, kind of her granddaughter, you know, kind of RBG's granddaughter points out, she's like, I graduated from Harvard in 2017. I was the first class. It took 200 years from, you know, for that to occur. And so, you know, we have to be a little bit patient and understand kind of how society changes. But the thing that's different is that we now have permission. We have permission where the society's ready to kind of have the conversation now, despite how uncomfortable it is. Again, strongly dissenting. Everybody needs to strongly dissent and say, these truths no longer serve us. They're hurting everyone.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. We can all leave this evening with our RBG ethos of strongly dissenting and challenging established truths. maybe one last question. I know I said that
Sure.
one would be the last,
Oh,
but
you're good. I'm good. As you guys know, I could probably talk about this stuff all night. So I'll
what,
stay here as long.
what do you think about intergenerational living and that impact on
Oh.
our health as community? And because we have people in the congregation also doing intentional living, communal living.
Oh my God. I think that's amazing. So, and I'll try and do this without crying. I can't talk about my grandfather without crying. So, I would not be who I am had I not lived in a multi-generational situation. I mean, I was born into a teenage pregnancy. You know, my grandparents were my aunts and uncles. I mean, you know, it is an essential fabric to who I am, you know, to have a net of people that, you know, I'm not fully dependent on my parents. I'm not fully dependent on one person, you know, kind of, you know, having a multi-generational home, you know, allows the evolution of the story to occur purposefully. I mean, you know, personally, that was a choice my husband and I made because our children didn't have that, to move back from a gorgeous beach to live in Tulsa, Oklahoma, because we knew our children needed that extra net, that multi-generational exposure, aunts, uncles, grandparents, you know, kind of, you know, it doesn't have to be blood. I mean, we had a whole family constellation of people that, you know, supported us. You have to have those multi-generation, because kids need to have other adults to go to besides their parents. I mean, they just need it. That's, you know, kind of our tribe of 150 is that there's a reason for that, right? We have to have that circle family, the second family, and the third family, so that we can all appropriately learn the history and carve out the future. So totally agree with that thought, for sure.
Thank you.